Welcome to the world of Mark's Money Mind, coming to you from the Rocky Mountain town of Crested Butte, Colorado. I'm your host, Mark Troutman, CFP. This educational, personal finance show combines money lessons, timely topics, personal stories, and community wisdom to help listeners and viewers master their finances to enjoy a stress-free life of financial freedom. Welcome to episode number 13, Lucky 13. And so for Lucky 13 or Unlucky 13, I thought I would talk about paying off credit cards. In episode number 8, we talked about optimizing credit card rewards with the understanding that you need to pay off those cards in full every month to avoid interest on those cards. And then the rewards can be worthwhile. But if you're carrying any interest, it completely offsets the benefit of accumulating rewards. So I wanted to talk about how to pay off your debts or figure out a way out of debt in this maybe unlucky 13 episode. And I also wanted to talk about the negative effects that debt can have. We talked about compounding for our benefit in episode 11. If you have debt, it's kind of negative compounding, so it's working against you. And I want to show you some examples of how this works, because a lot of people don't really realize how costly carrying debt on a credit card especially can be. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples here. So the first one is, let's say we go on vacation, we spend $3,000, we put it on a credit card. Maybe we come back and life happens and we find that we're not able to pay it off right away. Again, in the Optimizing Credit Card Rewards episode number 8 and other episodes, we've talked about saving first for vacations, so that doesn't become an issue. But let's just use the example that you've charged $3,000 on a credit card and you've come back from vacation and your plan is to just pay minimum payments until it's paid off, because you say, hey, if I pay the minimum payment, my credit score is going to be fine because I'm making my on-time payments. I'm not doing anything wrong. What you would find is that most credit cards today charge an interest rate in the mid-20s. The average is around 24% today. If we were to look at that vacation, for example, at $3,000, let's just quickly calculate what 24% of $3,000 is. So 3,000 times 0.24, that's $720 per year in interest. Now, the way most credit cards work is that the minimum payment is either a stated amount, like $25, for example, or it's something like the interest plus 1% of the balance. If you were to pay the minimum payment on a credit card that had a balance of $3,000 with an interest rate of 24% and paid that minimum of $25 or the interest amount plus 1%, which is kind of the standard going rate for minimum payments, it would take you 183 months to pay that debt off. That's 15 years and 3 months. And that, of course, assumes that you do not make any more charges on that card, which is pretty rare for someone who is carrying a balance on their card. The total interest amount would be $4,886, in addition to also having to pay the $3,000 you borrowed on the card back, for a total of $7,886. That's just massive. It's just amazing that paying just the minimum payment is basically a life sentence with this credit card. I titled this episode Slaying the Debt Dragon, and maybe it's because I was recently watching the trilogy of The Hobbit. I am going to New Zealand later this year, and one of the excursions is to visit where the filming of that movie was done, or at least a part of the filming. And I had not seen that movie in a long time. And of course, there's dragons and dragons that breathe fire. And I think of having credit card debt as a hair on fire situation. You need to put that fire out as quickly as possible. So I just thought it would be fun to title this Slaying the Debt Dragon. We need to get that debt gone, especially if it's fire breathing, charging us 24%. Now, you may ask, what is the average credit card debt per borrower in the United States? And that is $6,218 from a recent survey. I think it was TransUnion did that survey. So let's put that same number, $6,218, through that same exercise at 24%, paying the minimum payment. It would take you 256 months to pay that off. That's 21 years and 4 months. And that, again, assumes you don't add anything else to your credit card. And that is usually not how people are using their credit cards. So if you're adding charges every month and paying the minimum payment, you're just extending that payoff period probably for the rest of your life, potentially. And by the way, the interest on that would have been $11,287, which is nearly double the amount you borrowed in just interest. So credit cards have very high interest rates, definitely not a way to borrow money. Highly recommend you pay them off in full every month. We are going to talk about what is a strategy to get these paid off and paid off for good. But I do want to talk about a couple of other things. You'll often hear stores, for example, especially stores that have high cost goods, so it might be furniture, electronics, offering you 0% financing. And they might say, oh, come on in, no down payment, 0% financing for 12 months. A lot of people bite on that because they say, oh, wow, 0%, this is great. The problem is, if you read the fine print, typically what will happen is if you do not pay it off within the stated term, that interest, whatever the rate is, and frequently it's fairly high, is going to be charged retroactively back to the purchase date. So while it sounds enticing, and if you're disciplined, could potentially be an advantage to take advantage of, but it is something that they frequently expect the consumer to basically fail on and not pay it off in full. And then all of that interest gets charged retroactively. And that's kind of the bet that the lender, in the case of these typically financial institutions, it's not the store that's lending you the money, it's a financial institution. And the store may give them a little bit of upfront payment for doing that financing, but the finance company is also hoping that you don't pay it off by the time that you're required to and then charge you back interest. I just think it's better to just avoid that. Save up in advance, and maybe if you pay in cash for something, maybe you can get that discount and just say, hey, I'm paying cash. Can you give me a discount? Another thing I want to talk about is the way that interest is accrued on credit cards. We talked about in the Optimizing Credit Card Rewards episode that you have a grace period to pay that card off. But that only applies if you come into the statement period with a zero balance. In other words, you've paid your prior balance off in full. You have that grace period. If you carry any balance over to the next month, any charges you make in that month start accruing interest immediately. Another reason to make sure you pay off your cards in full every month. You will not get that grace period if you do not pay that card off in full. A lot of people aren't aware of that. Many credit cards also offer cash advances, typically not to the full credit line, but if you read the fine print, there may be a fee involved. It may be a flat fee or a percentage fee. And again, the interest will accrue immediately. And usually those interest rates are even higher than the rate on purchases on your card. So if your card was, say, 24% for purchases, it may be 29.99% for cash advances. A horrible way to borrow money is taking a cash advance on your credit card. Okay, so what do we do? Well, the best thing to do is take an inventory of all of your debt. List them all out by type, what is the balance on each one, what is the interest rate on each one, and what are the terms of repayment. So if it's an auto loan, for example, and maybe it was a 5-year loan and now it's got 3 years left, notate that as well. And then what I want you to do is for each one of those lines, take the balance that you have outstanding, multiply it by the interest rate, and write that number down. That's the annual amount of interest you would pay on each one of those debts. And then go down to the bottom and total up all of the balances, and then total up all of the interest. This is what was very eye-opening to my wife and I. When we first started out, newlyweds and had an apartment and we had new jobs and we were spending money on credit cards and borrowing money to pay for our wedding and stuff like that. It wasn't until we did this exercise that we said, wow, we are paying a lot of money in interest on these debts. And for us, it was primarily credit card debt. And it just blew our mind. We're just like, this is not good. This is not a way to make progress. So that was the eye opener for us. There are a couple of ways to pay that off. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about what some people will do. Some people will say, okay, I see I've got all these debts. Some of these have high interest rates. Maybe a debt consolidation loan is for me. In theory, that sounds like a good idea. You go to a financial institution and you ask for a personal loan, and they may even take the loan and pay off your credit cards directly. That sounds like a really good idea, right? You say, hey, I'm going to borrow money at a lower rate and pay off this higher rate debt, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. The problem is that when people do that, and I will explain a little story about that in a moment, but they tend to run those credit cards right back up again because it's the behavior that needs to be addressed, not just the fact that you have the credit card debt. And some other people will also say, I'll get a new card with a 0% introductory rate and I'll transfer my balances over there. That also sounds like a good idea, right? Why wouldn't I want to move my 24% interest rate balance over to a 0% interest rate card? Again, in theory, it sounds good, but typically what happens is people will then not necessarily pay it off in the 0% introductory rate. And yes, they've gotten a lower rate for a period of time, but then they're right back in the same situation. Typically, those cards will also come with a transfer fee when you transfer the balance from one card to another, and it can be in the neighborhood of 3%, typically is what I see. Some other people will think about taking a home equity line of credit because what you're doing is you're trading an unsecured debt in the form of a credit card with secured debt, which is what a home equity line of credit is. It's secured against the value of your home, and therefore the interest rate is lower. Again, sounds good in theory, but that frequently doesn't work, and I will explain how I know that doesn't work for many people in a moment. And then some people say, well, my 401k, I can borrow against my 401k. And typically 401ks have a loan provision, and it's usually up to half of the value of your 401k or to a maximum of $50,000. And what happens is if you, let's say, had funds in your 401k and they were invested, they will sell that investment, transfer the money to you, and then you have to pay yourself back with interest. And that interest rate today is somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, 8.5% to 9.5%. So you say, oh, well, that's all right because I'm paying myself a high interest rate and I'm paying it to myself. So this is good. The problem is this. If you lose your job, frequently repayment is required in short order, sometimes 30, 60, or 90 days. That's usually the time that it's going to be difficult to repay that loan, right? And then you would, in essence, default if you didn't pay for it. And it would be considered a distribution, which would be taxable. And if you're under age 59 and a half, subject to a 10% early withdrawal penalty. So adding insult to injury there. So not a great idea. The other thing is that the interest that you're paying yourself may sound good, but think about it this way. You are paying yourself back with money that's already been taxed right out of your paycheck back into the 401k. And then when you take it out down the road, in essence, you're going to have to pay tax again on the interest that you paid yourself. So effectively, you're getting double taxed on that interest you've paid yourself back. So while an 8.5 or 9% rate to yourself sounds good, you are going to be double taxed on that. Now, how do I know that the HELOCs and debt consolidation loans don't work for a lot of people? Well, my wife used to be a mortgage loan officer. Their business primarily was refinancing second mortgages, home equity lines of credit, things like that. And she would frequently have people come to her for these debt consolidation loans. And of course, she being the good person that she is, would try to talk them out of it and say, just pay off your credit cards and don't borrow money against your house to do it. She had to lend them money if they qualified, if they requested it. So she would do it. And then what she would find is that maybe a year later, they'd be back again, because they ran their credit cards back up again and want another debt consolidation loan. And it was just this repeat cycle. Frequently, debt consolidation loans don't work well because people haven't treated the cause of the over purchasing on credit cards. So you're probably better off just trying to tackle it straight ahead and slay that dragon, that fire-breathing dragon. How do we do that? Well, there are two primary approaches that people will use to pay off, especially things like credit cards. And they have terms, and the terms are the Snowball approach and the Avalanche approach. Now, one is more psychological and one is more mathematical. The psychological approach is the Snowball approach. So remember, we lined up all of those debts with balances and interest rates. The Snowball approach would say, pay off the one with the smallest balance first. So in other words, pay minimum payments to all the other debts with the exception of the smallest, and then put all of the excess funds you have available to get that done and gone quickly. It's a psychological win. But the problem is, if it's not your highest interest rate loan, it's not really the best from a mathematical standpoint. And that brings us to the Avalanche approach. The Avalanche approach is tackling the highest interest rate first without regard to the balance. So in that case, you would line them up by interest rate, let's say putting the highest interest rate at the top and the lowest in the bottom of the list, focusing on paying minimum payments to all the cards or loans that have all but the highest interest rate, and focusing all of the extra cash flow towards paying off the highest interest rate loan or card first. And typically it is going to be a card because that is usually what has the highest interest rates. And that is mathematically the best way to tackle it. There's also the hybrid approach. And I like to think of the hybrid approach as a way to get a psychological win, but do it mostly mathematically. And that's kind of what we did. I think, and this was a very long time ago that we were in this situation. It was probably like going back 30 years ago now, I guess. I do recall that we had, I think, one credit card that had a very low balance on it. I know it wasn't the highest interest rate, but they were all fairly equivalent. And it was just a nice quick win to just get that one gone. And we got our psychological win, but then we went to the Avalanche approach and then got rid of everything that way. Which ones to prioritize? Well, if you're going to take the Snowball approach, it's going to be the smallest one, right? If you're going to do the Avalanche approach, it's going to be the largest interest rate. If you're going to do the hybrid, maybe you find a small win so it feels good, and then you go for the highest interest rate debts first. Typically, they're going to fall in this order because this is kind of the order of the interest rates of different types of loans you will see out there. Payday loans have exorbitant interest rates. A payday loan is when you basically go to, I like to think of them as loan sharks, places that are like, get cash now, and they have storefronts. And you may walk in there and say, my next paycheck is going to be this on next Friday. And they'll be like, okay, we'll lend you a certain percentage of that. When you get paid, you come back, or actually they may even request details of your paycheck, because I've never done this, but my understanding is that they are able to get paid back without issue. But the interest rates, it may sound like they usually, from what I understand, quote it in dollars, and you're not converting it to an interest rate. And you're thinking, oh, it's only a couple of bucks over the next, 7 days. Well, that may not sound like much, but if you were to calculate what it would be on an annual interest rate, it can be exorbitant. And then people basically get tied into these payday loans, and, because by the time the next paycheck comes around, they're short again. So it's just this cycle that goes on and on and on. And that would be the first one to extricate yourself from as rapidly as possible. The next one might be buy now, pay later loans. You're hearing more about these where you can buy it now and pay for it later. And if you don't pay it off in time, it's going to be a high interest rate, but those are usually not great. Again, if you want to buy something, save for it first. You'll get more satisfaction. You may even be able to negotiate a discount, and you may find that you really didn't want it in the first place. The next higher interest rate loan brings us to the credit cards. They have relatively high interest rates, like we talked about, 24% in many cases. Then the next one usually is going to be something like a personal loan. These are usually unsecured loans. You might go to the bank and ask for a personal loan, and they will usually have interest rates less than the credit cards, but more than secured loans. And secured loans come in the form of a loan against an asset. So that might be a boat, an RV, a motorcycle, a car. And those loans, because they're secured and the bank has the ability to repossess that asset, they will typically have lower interest rates, not the lowest interest rates, but lower. And again, that may also depend highly on your credit scores. Lower your credit score, the higher the rate, the higher your credit score, the lower the rate. The next type of loan you might have is a mortgage. Usually these are going to have some of the lowest interest rates. For a while there, you could get 2 and 3% mortgage loans. No longer. Today, they're in the 6 and 7% range. They are also asset-backed, which means that if you don't pay your mortgage, they can come and repossess your home in the form of a foreclosure. And then there are student loans. There are federal student loans and private student loans. Federal student loans usually have fairly low rates. Federal loans, by the way, have fixed rates. So when you take the loan out, that rate is set for the life of the loan. Whereas private loans typically are variable rate. So that rate can change over the course of the loan period. And right now, they are going up with all interest rates. I definitely would be prioritizing the ones with the higher rates. That would be my approach, the Avalanche method. And then once you get to loans like a mortgage, you may want to then start going back to the normal amortization schedule on a mortgage, for example, especially if the rate is somewhere like 7% or less. And student loans, typically, especially federal ones, are going to have lower rates. So you may want to just pay on the normal payment schedule, which is usually a 10-year payback. What I would also do while you're focusing on this is take those credit cards out of your wallet, because if you keep using them, it's going to make it very messy to try to pay it back. And any additional charge you make is, of course, going to be charged interest. So one thing you could consider doing is take them all out of your wallet. I've heard people freeze them in ice and put them in their freezer, like in case of emergency thaw. Or they put them somewhere where it's a very big effort to get to them. And in some cases, just cutting them up and just saying, once this is paid off, I'm going to just cancel this card. Some people do the envelope method, which is using literal cash in envelopes. Today, that's not as, common, I guess you would say, because a lot of people don't pay in cash anymore. You could use a debit card to pay for everything, or you could use a credit card like a debit card. So let's say you have a card with no balance on it, or you have one of your cards that you're going to pay off in full and now it has no balance. You could use it to make your monthly purchases and pay it off in full every month. Certainly, I would suggest tracking the amount that you're charging on that card very much like you would do with a debit card. And even potentially, if you have a check register, if you do it online, maybe putting a debit in there for those charges as they occur. Or what some people will do is there's no rule against paying your card off more frequently than the monthly, after the monthly statement comes. You can go online and pay your card down or off anytime you want. So what some people will do is maybe they like to live more on a weekly spending schedule. They like to know, I spend $200 in groceries every week. So they go to the grocery store, they charge it on a credit card, and then maybe you pick one day a week and you say, I'm going to pay off that credit card at the end of the week. And then you're kind of using it like a debit card. Instead of each charge coming out of your checking account as they occur, you're just doing it in a weekly basis, for example. But think of using that credit card like a debit card. Definitely track all the charges so you know exactly what they're going to be. You could even have a notepad, or you could create a note in your phone so you know exactly what those charges are, so you know where you are. Now, here's the nice thing about this. So if you're going through this and focusing on paying off your credit cards and you're whittling them down, let's just go with 5 hypothetically. And let's say the minimum payment was $50 on each one. So that's $250 across all the cards. But you're saying, I'm going to pay $500 a month towards getting these things gone. So you're paying $50 to 4 of them, and then you're paying $300 to the one you're trying to pay off with maybe the highest rate, for example. And then when that one's done, you move down the list. Now you've got 4 cards with $50 minimums. You pay minimums to 3, so that's $150. And then you're paying $350 to that card with the highest interest rate if you're following the Avalanche approach until you're done. And by the time you get to the last card, you're paying $500 a month until it's gone. Now, once those cards are gone and that $500 gets freed up, I would consider using that $500 to start investing or increasing your investments if you're already investing, because you've already created the discipline of finding or having an extra $500 in your monthly cash flow to pay off these debts. But once they're gone, you can redirect that to saving and investing. And so what could you do that towards? Well, certainly we've talked about emergency savings accounts. I would work on getting that up to in the neighborhood of 3 to 6 months of kind of your base living expenses. You could, if you haven't already, enroll in your employer 401k plan. Hopefully you have, at least to get the match. But if you haven't, definitely raise that amount so you get the full match. If you have a high deductible health plan that's eligible for the health savings account, you could consider funding that. Certainly there are IRAs, whether they're traditional or Roth IRAs, to fund. And then you can always just save it in other savings accounts or brokerage accounts. The good news is that once you tackle this debt, you will have this kind of spigot available to redirect and create, hopefully, a lot of compounding going forward. And once you've done that, maybe you go back and listen to the wonder of compounding and get a lesson in that to see how this could really be advantageous going forward. I know this episode probably doesn't benefit everyone in the audience. Hopefully, if you're in this situation, it benefited you. Or if you're not in this situation and you know someone who is, I would appreciate it if you would forward this to them, and maybe this will help them with getting out of debt and then potentially starting to save and invest going forward. I hope this was helpful. This next weekend, I am actually going to be at a Camp Fi in Richmond, Virginia. And my goal is to have some interviews from people there, maybe a live podcast or 2, potentially, and publish those. So maybe if I can get my act together and get them all done and edited before next week, I can release them. There may be a chance that normally this comes out on Wednesday, but next week, if push comes to shove, hopefully I can get it out by Wednesday. But if not, I certainly hope to have it out by Thursday at the latest. So thank you for listening, and I will see you again on Mark's Money Mind. Thank you for listening to this week's show. Please click follow on your favorite podcast player or subscribe on YouTube to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. Also, please leave a rating and review for the show. This helps improve the ranking and enables other like-minded people find the content in their podcast players. If you would like me to answer a question on the show, please send it to mark@marksmoneymind.com and put podcast question in the subject line. Let me know your first name, or let me know if you would like to remain anonymous, and also your state of residence if you choose. I would also appreciate it if you would recommend this show to friends and family that might benefit from this content. See you next week on the Mark's Money Mind show. Until then, make some, save and invest, live on the rest. And now for the all-important disclaimer. This show is for education and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered investment, tax, or legal advice. Please consult the appropriate advisor or advisors before implementing anything you hear on this show or any other show for that matter. While I fully intend for everything on this show to be true and accurate at the time of each recording, occasionally errors may occur. So please do your own due diligence on anything discussed.